Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of the Build Change Guide to Resilient Housing, an essential handbook for governments and practitioners. I'm Monica Schrader, the Associate Director of Global Advocacy at Build Change. Today is World Habitat Day, and we are so thankful to be marking this important day with you and launching such a big milestone in the publication of the Build Change Guide. We have participants joining from all over the world, from Colombia to Nepal and beyond. Safe, healthy housing is needed now more than any other time in history. This summer alone, we've seen a devastating earthquake in Haiti, Hurricane Ida hitting the Gulf Coast, fires and heat waves in the West. All of these events have meant that thousands of people have lost their homes. About 1 in 5 people worldwide live in substandard housing, and that number is growing every day. Homes should provide us with the ultimate protection, so how can we ensure protection for all? At Build Change, we believe that we don't need to build new. We can build better. We can strengthen the majority of homes to withstand disasters. Build Change has revolutionized the field of disaster-resilient housing by articulating and demonstrating a holistic model of simultaneously overcoming the barriers to resilient housing. We mobilize people, money, and technology to transform the systems for regulating, financing, building, and improving throughout the world. And we hope to support you to do this work as well through the publication that we're launching today, the Build Change Guide to Resilient Housing. It serves as a handbook to provide governments, funders, and practitioners around the world with the tools they need to carry out and support resilient housing programs at scale. It's meant to serve both as a summary of the Build Change philosophy and model, as well as a practical manual focused on the design of national strategies, as well as operational and investment plans. Build Change and our partners have made more resilient housing achievable in many markets, so we've included real case studies in the guide from around the world, including Colombia, Haiti, Indonesia, Philippines, and Nepal. We show in practical terms how the Build Change approach can be used across a wide range of country and disaster contexts, regardless of a country's technical and financial constraints. You can download the Build Change Guide on your Resources tab if you check the left side of the screen on your browser, as well as downloading other documents that can help you improve resilient housing and get to know us better. You can also ask us questions during the entire event. If you go to the left-hand side of your screen, use the Ask a Question tab. Please be sure to include your contact information and we will get back to you. Lastly, we'd love to hear from you. We've included our contact email, info@buildchange.org, on the Resources tab, and we welcome the opportunity to exchange on resilient housing wherever you are. And with that, I'd like to welcome Build Change's founder and CEO, Dr. Elizabeth Hausler, to give some remarks. Elizabeth?
We can build better. I love that. That's so great. Thank you so much, Monica, for introducing the Build Change Guide to Resilient Housing and making that urgent, clear case for why we should work together to universalize access to resilient housing. Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Hausler, the founder and CEO of Build Change. We are delighted and so grateful to all of you and to our many partners and supporters who are making resilient housing a reality around the world. Housing provides us with so much, meeting basic needs, providing protection, and giving us an opportunity for growth. Monica, can you show the slide of the Build Change Resilient Housing wheel? This is the first glimpse of the many resources you'll find in the Build Change Guide. There are so many people to thank. I can't begin to name them all, but I want to acknowledge and thank the World Bank Global Program for Resilient Housing, and especially Luis Treveno, who's a true champion of the cause of resilient housing worldwide. We very much appreciate your partnership. No launch event would be complete without a story about what resilient housing means to real people, especially women. So I want to share one of my favorite stories from Haiti. It's about Benicet and her family. After working a full day at her beauty salon downstairs, it took only 25 seconds for Benicet's world to turn upside down. Her house was damaged by the 2010 earthquake near Port-au-Prince, making her family almost instantly homeless. But Benicet wanted to save her house, and she believed it could be done. Build Change agreed. We worked with her to strengthen and repair her home using simple and cost-effective solutions at a far lower cost and lower carbon footprint than replacing her home with a new one. Together, we made her house safer and stronger than it was before, not just for her, but for her family. Benesset told us what she needed to live a healthy and secure life, and we listened. We enabled her not only to move back in, but also to reopen her beauty salon and to safely build a second floor apartment for her mother. This story illustrates the first point I want you to take away from the guide. Power is and always must be in the hands of the homeowner. At Build Change, we recognize and respect the power that homeowners or home occupants should have in decision-making when it comes to their houses. Not building the houses themselves, not sweat equity, but the ability to make informed decisions about materials, about architecture, about livelihood, and about safety. Since meeting Benesset, we've worked with thousands of homeowners around the world to strengthen and improve their homes, to withstand disasters and improve their daily lives. Build Change puts the knowledge and access to financing in the hands of the homeowners so that they can make critical decisions about their own homes and their safety. You can read more stories in the guide and on our website, as well as case studies of where Build Change has implemented resilient housing programs around the world. The second thing that I want you to take away today is that there is a path to resilient housing for every single country, state, territory, and city in the world. In part 3 of our guide, we've provided a clear pathway for how resilient housing leaders prepare, plan, implement, and successfully complete a resilient housing program. We want to share these lessons with you so that the task of starting a housing program isn't so daunting. We want you to know it can be done. We encourage you to take a look at the steps and contact us so we can support you in the process. And the third and final point that we want you to take away from today is that one-off interventions are not enough. We need systems change for resilient housing to become the norm. That means breaking down silos and working together. It means adopting solutions that simultaneously engage people, improve policy, facilitate access to money, and use technology for scale. We've provided our lessons learned in the guide on the most effective ways to overcome these barriers: people and policy, money and technology, or as we like to say at PMT. We encourage you to apply it where you're working. So here's the first call to action for today. Governments, banks, donors, multilaterals, engineers, architects, city officials, construction workers, and homeowners all need to be part of the resilient housing process. And we've got several of those representing on our panel today. I'm excited to leave off with Sameh Waba from the World Bank. Sameh is Global Director of the Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience, and Land Global Practice at the World Bank. Sameh, it's a pleasure to have you on our virtual stage today. I want to talk with you about the P and the M parts of our model, policy and money. When Build Change expanded our work beyond post-disaster to work in prevention or strengthening buildings before the next earthquake or hurricane, we recognized that we needed to mobilize both capital for strengthening buildings and political will and policy change. In other words, resilient housing needed to be prioritized and funded at the global policy level. We're so pleased to support your launch of the Global Program for Resilient Housing in 2018. So before I ask you my question, I want to say thank you for this partnership and congratulate you and your colleagues on making this program a reality. I should also note that the World Bank recently signed a $137 million loan with the government of Colombia for improving existing housing. This is a big deal and one of the most important loans to date for existing home improvement to withstand disasters and meet people's daily needs. So what does this $137 million loan mean for resilient housing in Colombia? And how can this model be replicated in other countries?
Thank you, Elizabeth, and it's a pleasure to join you and colleagues in this launch, and congratulations on the launch of the guide. So taking the example of the Resilient and Inclusive Housing Project in Colombia, which is a $137 million loan from the IBRD, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the objective of this project is to provide well-targeted housing support to both poor and vulnerable groups. And these include Colombians, but also Venezuelan migrants, with a focus on resilience and sustainability. So the project will support home improvements in 25 municipalities across the country. So I mean, anywhere from Bogota in the center, Cartagena in the north, Cali in the west, and Arauca in the east. And in doing so, it will spur construction and job creation, which is an important demand, if you want, by Colombian youth. Now, we have two goals. One is to support the government of Colombia in reaching the most vulnerable Colombian households, those specifically who were not benefiting from the existing portfolio of housing solutions, which were predominantly focused on new housing construction. And the second objective is providing support to migrants from Venezuela. So in doing so, it introduces home improvement and rental subsidies so that they can help both households, so the home improvement subsidies for Colombian households and the rental subsidies for Venezuelan households. And these new subsidy schemes complement the existing portfolio of housing solutions that the government has. And they are a set of well-functioning programs that enable access to new housing construction. And in fact, in Colombia, more new homes were sold actually in 2020 than, let's say, in France or the UK. I mean, something that's north of 200,000 housing units. And in fact, when you go on a per capita basis to compare, if you will, the number of housing units sold per million inhabitants, you'll find that Colombia is amongst the most well-performing countries, including in OECD countries. But still with that, you have a large share of your subsidies going for new housing construction, whereas the large majority of population are living in substandard housing where the qualitative deficit is much harder to plug with a focus on new housing construction. In fact, home improvement subsidies to close the qualitative gap is a much better way of utilizing public resources because it usually costs somewhere between 3 to 5 times less than building of new construction units. And in Colombia, where we've done a quick calculation of the net present value of eliminating the qualitative housing deficit with support to upfront subsidies and to buy a new home with a mortgage, the figure was somewhere in the range of 25 billion, which was about 3 times that of trying to solve that deficit through home improvement subsidies that are focusing, among others, on structural strengthening to improve livability, but also resilient to disasters. Now, the ideal thing would be for us to be able to combine such subsidies with home improvement microcredit, with the technical assistance that's needed. And that's one of the things that the project will focus on to try to open up this segment. Now, the project is also interesting because it leveraged two new instruments. One is a grant from a fund for innovative global public good solutions within our IBRD window. And the second is a $21.7 million in concessional funding from the Global Concessional Financing Facilities that is meant to support the project focus on migrants from Venezuela, as well as their host communities by providing rental subsidies and infrastructure investment so that you can increase social cohesion in these host communities. Now, this project has a tremendous potential for replication. It's already being replicated in other countries in Latin America, but also in other regions. So, I mean, Mexico's moving in the same direction, balancing between subsidies provided for new housing versus for home improvement. Chile advanced in that direction a few years back. Peru and Ecuador are indicating that they're open to going in that direction. Elsewhere, we see similar interventions in, for instance, Indonesia, among other countries. So this notion of rethinking the deployment of subsidies from predominantly financing new housing construction, at unit costs of, $50,000, more or less, as we see in many of the countries that we work with, to thinking about home improvements, both for resilience and livability, and deploying subsidies that are much more targeted, because, I mean, there's also a geographic targeting that goes in there as well, and ensuring that you can achieve a much more impact in terms of the qualitative deficit. Thanks, and back to you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's so, the 3 to 5 times less is just so compelling, right? It's such a compelling cost benefit statistic for investing in upgrading existing housing. Thank you for making that point. I also am reflecting on this partnership in Colombia has such diversity and breadth. I mean, it's covering many different geographies. It's covering different levels of vulnerability of the occupants. It's generating jobs. It's creating incomes. It's looking at diverse sources of funding, and it just covers everything that's necessary in order to achieve this large-scale change. So again, congratulations. It's just such an exciting moment. But I'm sure it didn't happen overnight, right? I mean, it's a multi-year planning process that has to span multiple administrations, but it is possible, as you've proven, with the right timing and the right planning and the right leadership. So that's a great introduction to the sort of top-down perspective that needs to be there for these resilient housing programs to happen at scale. So now let's go from the bottom up, and I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Juan Caballero. Juan is Build Change's Vice President of Programs in Latin America and the Caribbean. Juan he's been with Build Change on the team since 2012, leading our work throughout much of the region, from Colombia to Dominica to St. Martin. So Juan, picking up and continuing on what Sameh said, how important is it to demonstrate then from the bottom up that resilient housing can be achieved? How'd you do that in Colombia, and what relationships are necessary for resilient housing to reach scale?
Hi, well, thank you. Colombia has two important things, I think. Well, many important things, but two are most important in this context. It has a high density, urban, vulnerable housing, and a government willing to make resilient housing happen. So political will is really important. Why is it that this is why we talk about people and policy first in our model? Because you need to start there in order to change resilient housing systems. Countries may be at different points in their housing journey, but the path is usually the same, and it always begins with people. People need to want resilient housing. But first, we do need to demonstrate that it can be done bottom up. In Colombia, the first homeowner to work with us in the south of Bogota was Mr. Jorge Prada. And we worked with him to strengthen his home and improving the way that he could live in it. By doing so, we proved to him, to his family, his neighbors, and the government that it could be done. It could be done at the price point of existing subsidies back then, in 2014, that we did this. We did it with Mr. Prada's existing construction skills. He's a construction worker. And we did it with less than 30% of the cost that it would have taken to replace his house. This single bottom-up demonstration in 2014 has now become a national scale home improvement program that has housing resilient front and center. So building trust at all levels is key. We had first to convince Mr. Prada to let us work with him in his house, but also we have been working with the Construction Code Authority in Colombia to let us roll out a simplified method to retrofit existing housing. We have been working with the Ministry of Housing to reform the subsidy laws to make this available to more people, with the city authorities to do the same. So again, people first, money for sure, and then the technology of doing it. We have a case study in our guide on how this process has worked in Colombia, starting with Mr. Prada. So I encourage everyone to read it and see how it's happening in Colombia.
Excellent. That's great, Juan. So yeah, there's a top-down element, and there's a bottom-up element, and there's a path to resilient housing. And that path is similar. Just like Sameh said, there's replication already going on. There is a pathway. And your point about Mr. Prada and the process kind of ties into one of the tools that we've developed in the guide, the Resilient Housing Ecosystem Assessment Tool, or RHEAT. RHEAT addresses all three of people and policy, money, and technology. And it can also provide a baseline as well as track progress against several key indicators and sub-factors needed to achieve resilient housing at scale. Monica's got the slide up here. And so please check out the Resilient Housing Ecosystem Assessment Tool and how it can be applied to your country, state, territory context. It provides an objective measure of how countries or states are advancing on the resilient housing journey and can be used at all of these levels, wherever you are in making on the path to resilient housing. All right, Camilo. So we've talked about national level decision-making. We've talked about access to capital through the World Bank, and we've talked about bottom-up working directly with homeowners to strengthen vulnerable housing. But let's talk about this space in the middle, about cities. Cities have a role to play in fostering an environment in which resilient housing is the norm. Camilo Zapata is the Risk Reduction and Emergency Support Executive at the Corporación Antioquia Presente. Camilo has been one of Build Change supporters in Medellin, Colombia from the very beginning, and knows firsthand about the high risk that vulnerable housing represents, since he's been at the front lines of disaster risk management in Colombia for years. Camilo, what motivates a city to take action on resilient housing, and how can systems change catalyst organizations like Build Change support cities like Medellin on your continuing journey toward resilient housing?
Okay, first of all, I want to say thanks to Elizabeth and Juan for inviting me to be part of this event, and also Build Change team to have us chosen Medellin City to be one of their cities to implement their strategies and their studies on resilient housing. This was really important for us on that time, because we have, like many of our former or before me presenters have said, we have a condition in our city that makes very vulnerable for different threats. Not only the one that we are trying to focus on this study, that's earthquake, but also many more. As Medellin, a little bit of context, is a city, is a valley surrounded by mountains that make it a dense populated area that have many of our housing developed over the past 50 years on the surrounding hills. That makes it really, really vulnerable for different kind of threats, from landslides, mudslides, and also flash flooding in case of very really heavy rainfall that we have in our city. So this is really important for us, and we see it in the city as a really very good tool to implement and to see our future, and how can we make really a difference and a change in the life of the people that live in those kind of housing. Couple of reasons why we see it as a good strategy for the city. One of it is that our city for the past 50 years has grown exponentially in their housing, and the most important part of it is that many of it have been on the informal housing, non-compliant to code housing, that also makes it really vulnerable and difficult for the city. This is been growing and has been over the past years, because our city is really, really attractive for migration, not only Colombia, inside Colombia, but for other countries. The past 5 years, with the Venezuelan situation, we have been receiving a lot of migrants from other places, and this kind of people that come to Medellin come seeking opportunities. And these opportunities, or these kind of people, normally are socially vulnerable because they're really poor, they really have needs, and what they do is find a place to build a house, normally with the elements they find around, normally made out of wood and not, as I said, not compliant to code. Another thing is that our city has made an effort on figuring out and construction of a manual and disaster management plan, and we did it in 2016, and we defined 7 different kind of threats for the city, kind of prioritizing which ones were the most important, or they have the biggest impact on the city, being earthquake one of those 7, if not the most probable to happen in our city. It will have the most impact because of the kind of construction and the housing we have in our city. We need to understand it also in an economic perspective. Most of the people that have this kind of houses are the poorest ones, the ones that have the most needs. And having something that we can do to improve the quality of their houses, improve the safety of their houses, but at lower cost, that a city can have a program, is the way we should look at this problem. A way of reducing the vulnerability of the city is by improving the housing that already exists. We have more than 50,000 houses that we think as a city will be impacted by an earthquake of 6.5 magnitude on Richter. So this puts us in a really difficult position, and with a really nice, if you can see it that way, objective of how we can manage or how can we do this. So these are basic 3-4 things that as a city, and when I was in head of the disaster management office in the city, saw an opportunity with Build Change to kind of have a perspective and have a way, a tool that will make us easier to understand and to overcome the problem.
Thanks, Camilo. Yeah, it's refreshing to hear talking about reducing earthquake vulnerability, because there's a lot of attention being given to reduce climate vulnerability to climate hazards, and there very much should be. There's with hurricanes becoming and typhoons becoming increasingly more disastrous. There's an opportunity, though, to remember that some cities' biggest threats to housing stock are earthquakes, and we can create programs in which houses can be improved to withstand multiple hazards, to withstand earthquakes, to withstand strong winds, to deal with increasingly hot temperatures and those sorts of things. So there's an opportunity to address all of these issues at once. And cities really are the future for resilient housing, as more of the world's population lives in cities. Opportunities to densify and strengthen buildings at a lower cost than building new. So thanks very much, Camilo, for those remarks. Now I want to shift to technology. When we started strengthening existing buildings, we got some pushback that the evaluation, engineering, design, construction process for improving existing housing was going to be too complex and too expensive compared to just building new. But our engineering team has been working to debunk this perception and show that it's both accessible and often even preferable. And this has been largely led by my colleague, Lizzie. Lizzie Collins is Build Change's Vice President of Engineering. She's been with Build Change since 2013 and started working with us in Haiti in one of our first large-scale retrofitting projects. So Lizzie, in practical terms, what does it mean to make a house resilient? And can you give us some examples, and how much does it cost?
Great. Well, thanks so much, Elizabeth. And Monica, I wonder if you could pull up the resilient housing is graphic from the guide. Great. Thank you. So housing resilience is thought of often in terms of disaster resilience, and we look at it in those terms for sure. But we also need to think about it more holistically as providing a safe, culturally and contextually appropriate, healthy, and secure space for people. Further, resilient housing also needs to be affordable and also recognized as a financial asset that it can be. This may sound like a lot to tackle, but resilient housing is for everyone, and it can be done incrementally, strategically, step by step. There are simple things that can be done to make a house more resilient to disasters that are neither expensive nor complex, like securing down a roof with better connections to better withstand a hurricane or typhoon. In the guide, we go over some specific case studies of how to improve the kinds of buildings frequently used for housing, including examples of common vulnerabilities and solutions to fix them. We also include detailed examples of design and construction documents. In making housing resilient, we can also look at the possibility of bringing together structural improvements with other goals that are driven by health or habitability, and this can help achieve a more resilient home overall. Often these two kinds of improvements can actually overlap. For example, Adding walls for improved space distribution can also help to strengthen a home against earthquakes or typhoons. And sometimes we find that improving an existing house is actually an important first step in securing and growing it as an asset. It can be readying it for expansion that can be used for small business or for rental space, for making the project more sustainable and also more attractive to the occupant or homeowner. Monica, can you please bring up the example of the retrofit and expansion from the Lamika project? Great, thanks. So this house was retrofit and expanded, both with grant funding as well as a homeowner contribution. And while this example is a project from Haiti, we actually talk about several examples of retrofitting and expansion for densification in the guide, both in the case studies for Colombia as well as the Philippines. And overall, we actually found that typically about 40% of the total cost of improving existing houses is invested in achieving these other goals, like habitability improvements or expansions, beyond just disaster mitigation. And speaking of cost, upgrading existing housing is very cost effective using structural and non-structural improvements. Build Change undertook a study of evaluating the cost of retrofitting across our various programs, and we found that it was on average only 23% the cost of average new construction costs in the study locations. On top of that, rebuilding after a disaster is always more expensive than prevention for several reasons, including things like disrupted supply chains after a disaster, labor shortages, and more. So if anything, this data should tell us why we need to be thinking about strengthening housing right now in every disaster vulnerable location if we want to use our resources most effectively for resilience.
So yeah, rebuilding, I want to emphasize that point, Lizzie. Rebuilding after a disaster is always more expensive in every way, financial, human capital, so many different ways there. Thank you very much for that. So strengthening existing housing now is our really best alternative, improving people's daily lives as well as helping to ensure that they're safe in the next disaster. Also, doing so consumes less resources, so it's more gentle on the planet as well than having to rebuild new. So we have to keep in mind that this is about meeting people's needs, both now and in the future. All right, so next I want to go to Janelle Maffei. Janelle Maffei is the Chief Mitigation Officer at the California Earthquake Authority. You and I share a history, Janelle. We both are Cal grads, both engineers, and I feel like we've been proceeding down parallel paths here with the work we've been doing in Colombia with government partners and in the Philippines with microfinance partners and elsewhere. And the California Earthquake Authority's work strengthening existing housing by bringing all of people, money, and technology to the forefront. So I'm pleased to have you join us today with a U.S. perspective. My question for you is at the intersection of technology and money. The U.S. has 140 million housing units. 55% of them are in disaster-prone areas. That is a huge proportion of the U.S. housing stock. Yet home strengthening programs often don't take off because there is an expectation that a house should meet the standard for new construction, which is often not necessary or required. You've shown the value of focusing on fixing a subset of common deficiencies. Can you tell us more about the California Residential Mitigation Program, Strengthen Your House? And the CEA's website provides a helpful resource on how do you pay for a retrofit. So how does that happen? How does the CEA fund retrofits?
Great. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure to be here. So the California Earthquake Authority and the Earthquake Brace and Bolt program are unique in that we are leveraging insurance funding to take federal grant money and put it into retrofits of houses. And as you mentioned, not to bring them up to full code. So let me tell you a little bit about the CEA. We're an instrumentality of the state of California, created after the Northridge earthquake in 1994 to manage a state earthquake insurance pool for single family houses. So that's 1 to 4 families in a house. 1 to 4 units. It's publicly managed and privately financed. California has about 2/3 of the U.S. earthquakes risk, with most of our population living along the San Andreas earthquake fault zone. Mitigation was part of the original plan for the California Earthquake Authority, and so we set aside around $5 million US per year for mitigation. We established the California Residential Mitigation Program jointly with the California Office of Emergency Services. So that's like the state of California's FEMA. Most houses in the Western U.S. are wood framed. We have a temperate climate, access to timber, and those tend to be light and redundant houses. And when I say they do well in earthquakes, they do well with the exception of the houses that come off their foundation. So if we can keep houses on their foundation, we really are way ahead, particularly of those of you who have these older masonry houses. The Western states have state building codes for new housing, so we really have made a lot of progress for new housing. But as you mentioned in these past presentations, we have these older houses. Now, California is a little different than most parts of the world in that old in the Western U.S. is pre-1980, and so what we've done is we've identified 4 really the worst vulnerabilities or deficiencies for seismic and older houses in the Western U.S. And those are houses that have a crawl space. So these are wood frames. So you've got maybe 6 or 7 steps up to that first floor. And you can't keep that house on the foundation because the walls around the crawl space don't have the stiffness and strength to do that. We have houses that are taller, where we put attached garages. So we've taken out all the walls on that ground floor, big garage door, also don't do well. Hillside homes, anytime that you have a house come off its foundation on a hillside, it's very dangerous. And then we have masonry chimneys and masonry veneer and things around the fireplace that we consider damaged. So what we're doing is we're going in and we're fixing those vulnerabilities. We're not saying you have to bring the entire house up to full retrofit. We created the Earthquake Brace and Bolt program for that first cripple wall or crawl space house. We provide up to $3,000 in grants for a retrofit that's about a $5,500 retrofit. So that's a pretty good chunk of that retrofit. We are going to be introducing a supplementary grant for low-income homeowners so that we can pay for the entire retrofit for our low to moderate income homeowners. And then once again, we leverage our funds. We take that $5 million per year, leverage it to pay for the administration, and we're getting FEMA funds. We're currently distributing $24 million for retrofits. We're going to add a soft story. That's the house that has that garage on the first floor for both single and multifamily in the near future. And once again, code compliant retrofit. So the retrofit of the deficiency is completely code compliant, but we're not requiring that full retrofit of the house. We've got lots of walls upstairs that, they could be damaged, but they're not going to be catastrophic and collapse. So the idea is on our websites, we provide information on the hazard, simple visual cues, how you identify those deficiencies, information on what that code compliant retrofit is, directories on how to find contractors and engineers, and then information about that code compliant retrofit, how to provide funding, and then just exactly what you could expect with that retrofit.
I cannot wait to hear how the supplemental grant goes for lower and middle income homeowners. I think that's so exciting. It's such a great push out into a broader market and meeting people where they are and meeting their needs. Yeah, it's great. I can't wait to hear more about how that goes. Well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's so great because there's also such a diversity of sources of funding in your portfolio, which I think is, really very important for all of the resilient housing programs around the world. So we, as we're developing the guideline, we put the funding into these 3 buckets: fundings for materials and labor. Obviously, there needs to be a funding for, the bricks and mortar or the rebar, whatever needs to be done. Funding to pay the construction worker. And then there's a second bucket of funding needed for program implementation, for assessment, for design, for quality control, permitting. And then there's this third bucket of funding, which may not be so obvious, for this broader systems change, for advocacy, for cause marketing, for demonstrating things can work, for supporting on policy change and those innovations. So here's where in our launch, I want to shout out to our donors and philanthropists and those who have supported resilient housing programs around the world. Your support is so useful and highly leveraged if we can use it to demonstrate and to unlock millions of dollars of capital to be put toward resilient housing. That's where we need your help the most. Okay, so we're going to do a final quick question about technology to Lizzie and Juan. I just want to come back very quickly. Lizzie, can you tell us about tools for automation of the design and assessment process? And Juan, can you tell me briefly just a bit about end-to-end technology platforms?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. So digital tech has become incredibly important for our work over the last few years, especially in the assessment, design, and construction phases. And we're working with tools like Revit, Fulcrum, and Dynamo to automate the housing improvement process. So, for example, we've developed Dynamo scripts in Revit, which is a building information modeling program. And these scripts help to auto-generate a building model, retrofit design, and the cost, all from field measurements of an existing house. But I think it's important to talk about also why we're using technology. It's enabling us and our partners to operate so much more efficiently. For example, we found that in our Nepal program, using these technologies, what once took a 3-person team 4 to 5 days, to do for each individual house could instead take one person just 3 hours. And so that's 97% less time. This allows us to think bigger and really delve into what it means to achieve resilient housing at scale, and how we maximize our efficiency and our resources to reach even more people, to make them safer.
Yeah, on end-to-end technologies, for example, we recently handed over a management information system to the government of Dominica. This was for the Housing Recovery Project, which is a government-led initiative supported by the World Bank and with technical assistance from us from Build Change. Hurricane Maria devastated the country and people needed new housing. And the government of Dominica wanted to provide resources to homeowners whose houses were completely destroyed by the storm. And they did not have existing resources or insurance to cover the cost of reconstruction themselves. So to do this, the government needed a system that would achieve several goals. First, receive and screen applications for potential beneficiaries for eligibility and eligibility criteria. Second, to review the existing site hazards such as flooding and landslides. And third, to manage administrative needs of contractors, tranche disbursements, and reporting requirements. So Build Change helped them to do this. We developed and rolled out a full end-to-end system that is able to meet all of those needs and connects governments to homeowners so that homeowners can get back into their houses faster and with stronger houses than before. The MIS, the system, it is a digital tool, was developed leveraging our accumulated experience in post-disaster reconstruction, and as such, incorporates a participative homeowner-led logic. It provides traceability, transparency, and efficiency to a process that would otherwise be cumbersome and unreliable. It has gone a long way in digitizing a public function, which will be used beyond reconstruction by the housing and planning departments in Dominica.
Yeah, technology. So yeah, we've talked about policy, we've talked about access to financing, but without technology, it's going to be difficult to scale resilient housing programs. So these technology investments are so important as we simplify processes and can focus on what really matters, which is safer buildings and safer people. Okay, I want to give, before our lightning round, I want to give the final word to Same. So today, Same, around 55% of the world lives in urban areas. By 2050, this number is projected to surpass 2/3 of the global population. So how does investment in resilient housing contribute to urban development and to the resilience agendas? How does it support sustainable, resilient growth?
Thanks, Elizabeth. In fact, investment in resilient housing and in livable housing as well contributes to a far larger set of objectives, most importantly, the Sustainable Development Goals, which cannot be achieved if we don't meet the housing objectives. I mean, good quality housing that is disaster resilient, that is climate resilient, and that is livable is critical to many of the SDGs, not just SDG 11, where it's explicitly stated, but just about the totality of the SDGs. I mean, we know that when you improve housing conditions, when you improve 10-year security, that are important intergenerational outcomes in terms of the improvement of the health and educational achievements of children who live in safer housing. We know that the ability to have an asset on which to lean on, and the ability to be able to monetize that asset, to be able to access housing finance, open businesses, contribute to peace and security, conflict reduction, and of course, most importantly, to poverty alleviation and the reduction of inequalities. But at the same time, across the developing world, the supply of formal, affordable, and resilient housing has not kept pace with the demand. In fact, there's a major mismatch caused by the dysfunctions in land markets, by challenging and inadequate planning and building regulations, lack of infrastructure, that have all resulted into poor people finding themselves shut out of the formal housing market and having no other solution but to develop housing that is informal, on either squatter arrangement in terms of land tenure, or informally developed, because usually their options are either you access affordable land and housing, often at considerable distances from where job opportunities are, or you do a trade-off where you trade off your livability so that you can have access to economic opportunity. And this is when there is the densification of slums and informal settlement and living on the slopes that are vulnerable to flooding and landslides and so on. So worldwide, almost 1 in 3 urban residents are living in inadequate homes, and this figure is not going down. These vulnerabilities include vulnerability to natural hazards, to climate change. And in Africa, the figure is about 75% of informal self-built housing. In Latin America, it's about 66%. And of course, the large majority have, a lack of security of tenure, which usually correlates with the households being unable to invest into home improvement because, you are not secure in your tenure, and then the structures are precarious, no durable roofs, walls, windows, etc. And then when an earthquake or a hurricane strikes, the house collapses rather rapidly, and the households lose the only asset that they have. And COVID-19 in particular came to remind us of the inequality that exists in cities and how poor people who are living in substandard housing are at a disproportionate risk of contagion. And our own work on predicting contagion hotspots by looking at the built environment and places and against densities, population densities, and where people can or cannot socially distance or have access to public infrastructure of the sort of public water standpipes or public toilets that could be vectors for a spread of the disease. This is invariably the landscape. The resulting mapping demonstrated the landscape or the geography of slums and informal settlements. Now, the climate crisis as well cannot be confronted if we do not have green housing. Because on top of that, buildings and construction sector account for 36% of final energy use, 39% of energy and process-related carbon dioxide emissions in 2018, and residential buildings account for about 74% of global building energy use. So in this regard, we definitely need green housing, we definitely need resilient housing for a large range of objectives, whether it's to tackle climate change, to be able to attain the Paris Agreement's target of 1.5 degrees Celsius, to be able to attain the SDGs, and at the same time to be able to, as you said, to create security for those households, because invariably this will be the most important asset, and in fact, oftentimes the only asset that they will have in their lifetime. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Oh, so well said. And so we don't want them to lose it in the matter of 10, 20 minutes or, a couple of hours. So thank you so much again, Samet, there was a range of hazards. There's a range of needs. There's a range of financing options, policy options. There's a range of technologies, but the message is that there is an opportunity for more people to have access to decent, disaster resilient, healthy housing. So we've discussed some really critical considerations for resilient housing today. How do we put the homeowner first? People always first. The diverse yet equally important funding needs and opportunities there are, and how we can automate for efficiency through technology. You can find all of this and more in the Build Change Guide. So I want to circle back to the speakers and ask them one final question in less than 1 minute each. What's the one thing that you want people to remember as they advance resilient housing agendas? And we're going to go in alphabetical order. So Camilo, Janelle, Juan, Lizzie, and Same. So Camilo.
Okay, this will be, if you can change how a person feels when they are in their house, you can change the way they feel about life itself. We need to change realities one at a time.
Beautiful. I love it. That's great. Janelle.
So it's every bit as much about listening as it is about talking. We're trying to convince people to do their part to have more resilient housing, and it takes more than just dropping in with money. It takes listening and understanding and partnering with people who are already trusted in their community, so that we can bring them a program that is relevant to them.
Well said. Wonderful, Janelle. Juan.
Well, unlike COVID, housing vulnerability is a disease with a known cure. All we need to do is make it available to all the people who need it.
I love it. That's so great. So vaccinate the house, just like you would vaccinate every member of the population. All right, we can do it. We have the vaccine. All right, Lizzie.
Great, thanks. Let's see. The majority of existing housing can be made safer, quickly and affordably using simple solutions that already exist. We have enough technical information to get started. I encourage everyone to check out the guide, particularly part 4 and the annexes, to access more information on these technical aspects, as well as how to operationalize getting started.
All right, Lizzie. And Same, last one to you.
So housing is the most important asset that poor people will own in their lifetime. So protect it means protecting them from poverty, from vulnerability, and helping them, basically create a lasting, asset and livelihood for themselves and their children.
Wonderful. Very well said. Thanks to all of you for these incredibly rich and motivating thoughts. Thanks to all of our panelists for being here today. Thanks to the audience for listening in. As we're wrapping up today's launch of the Build Change Guide for Resilient Housing, I want to express our gratitude for attending and for being advocates for resilient housing. Every one of you is an advocate for resilient housing, and the movement toward resilient housing for everyone is made stronger with champions from all sectors. Today's been an incredible opportunity to reflect on the past, the present, and the future of resilient housing, but there remains so much to be done. So let's join together to commit to strengthening existing housing. At Build Change, we seek to build a more resilient world, and we hope you'll join us. Thanks again, and back to you, Monica.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you to all of you participating today. We really wanted to express our gratitude for tuning in and for learning more about the Build Change Guide. This concludes our launch event. So as a reminder, you can download the guide in the Resources tab if you're still currently in the auditorium. And you can also download it at www.buildchange.org/guide to resilient housing. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to reach us via our email. And have a great day. Thank you, everyone.